Good afternoon, everyone. This is R.T. Ryback. I'm the CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, and we're really excited to welcome you to this, our third in a year-long series that we call Climate Reaction. Climate Reaction is about the intersection of climate and equity, two issues that are seen as independent crises and that we see as absolutely deeply connected if we're going to address the issues that face both our planet and our community right now. Today is going to be focused, especially with a tremendous community asset, the Nature Conservancy, and work they've been doing in natural climate solutions. And I want you to think about, if you've been to any climate discussion, so often it moves into the science behind climate, and it seems often like something that we have to invent something new to address. Well, the fact of the matter is, nature, when left to its own devices, can heal nature. That's what nature is about. And that is very much what's at the core of the work that Nature Conservancy has been doing and that we want to highlight today. Just to ground you in what the climate reaction has been over the past few months is we had the first two sessions were with some of the recipients of the Climate, Racial Equity and Climate Solutions Fund of the City of Minneapolis that we hold at the Minneapolis Foundation. That's been led on our end, by the way, by Paul Odegaard, who's just done an outstanding job on it. And it's a partnership with the McKnight Foundation and the City of Minneapolis. After those two sessions, we're now moving into natural climate solutions. And after we hear from this work with the Nature Conservancy, we're going to move this summer to summer site visits, where we will be visiting some of the great work going on, primarily in agriculture. But today, let's turn to the Nature Conservancy and let me welcome a really wonderful community resource who I've known and worked with over many years, and one of the real heroes in this community, Ann Mulholland, who leads the Nature Conservancy here in Minnesota. Ann, welcome.
Thanks for having me, RT. This is fabulous.
Yeah, well, we're really excited to have you here. You know, when people think about Nature Conservancy, they often think about preserving land. So why is Nature Conservancy now talking about natural climate solutions? How does climate work into your work?
I appreciate that a lot. And I'm going to ask Jessica to tee up our PowerPoint, if that's okay. I'm going to go through just a few slides.
Yeah, why don't you take a couple minutes and just give people a real grounding of this?
That's great. And I want to introduce real quickly my colleague, Jessica Blair, and also Sachi Graber. Sachi leads our climate policy for the chapter. So I'm glad to have her join me today, and she's going to help me through this a bit. So Jessica, go to the next slide. And first I want to start with our mission at the Nature Conservancy is to protect the land and water on which all life depends. We're a global organization impacting conservation work in more than 70 countries, but also here in Minnesota. Our chapter also includes North and South Dakota. Head to the next slide. We have 600 scientists, 3,700 staff across the globe, 1,350 active trustee volunteers, and more than 1 million members. Let's go ahead and sneak through. But this is kind of the real punchline. So to answer your question, RT, how is the Nature Conservancy engaged in climate change as a land and water conservation? Well, globally, the Nature Conservancy has two major goals, and both guide our work on climate change. We have a goal to not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, which aligns with the Paris Climate Agreement and the Biden administration's recent commitment. This goal directs our climate mitigation work to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the amount of climate change we see. The Convention on Biological Diversity has articulated a 30 by 30 goal, which means protecting 30% of the world's biodiversity by 2030. The Nature Conservancy boldly endorses this goal, again, as does the Biden administration. While primarily focused on conservation, the goal also requires us to think about climate adaptation because as we see temperatures rising and weather patterns changing, it's important for us to make sure our most important ecosystems, species, and communities will be sustained. Let's sneak to the next slide. Globally, around the world, floods, wildfires, hurricanes are wreaking havoc on the scale and frequency never before, as all of you know. Climate change is one of the world's most urgent challenges and an immediate risk to our communities. our economies, our health, and quite frankly, every living thing. It threatens the things we value most: our health, our lands, our waters, the well-being and prosperity of people around the world, and a growing population. In the last 50 years, temperatures in the Twin Cities, so right here, have risen more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and summer heat is becoming a deadly threat to some of our most vulnerable communities and residents. Rainfall in Minnesota is actually up 20%, and in that same time frame, leading to bigger and longer flooding events. Humanity actually has a really brief window, about 10 years or less, according to experts, to transition to a more stable climate future before nature reaches its tipping point and it becomes too late to intervene. In order to limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 50% by 2030 and completely neutralized by 2050. And all this sounds really daunting and challenging, but there's solutions, and the Nature Conservancy has some solutions as well. Let's sneak to the next slide. And it is very important to note that climate change is one of the greatest threats to equity, because we know that people who are least equipped to handle these big risks will bear the greatest burden of climate impacts. Here in Minnesota, one major example of that are heat islands. Let's go to the next slide. But actually, nature can help, and it actually has to help. A complete transition to a clean energy economy will only get us 2/3 of the way to the modest goals of the Paris Climate Accord. Through photosynthesis, natural climate solutions can capture 1/3 of the carbon emissions reductions required by 2030 to keep rising temperatures manageable for human life. The natural climate solutions are conservation, restoration, improved land management, and increased carbon storage to avoid greenhouse gas emissions in land and plant biomass. So, and natural climate solutions actually have a lot of added benefits: cleaning air and water, increasing soil fertility for food production, driving our economy, providing wildlife habitat, which we all appreciate, protecting our outdoor experience for everyone. So as you can see, our work on climate change works to advance both of those organizational goals that I articulated: limiting climate change and global conservation. Let's go to the next slide. So right here at home, we have so many opportunities. Natural climate solutions, they're critical to mitigate emissions through a number of pathways. This graph shows the potential of natural climate solutions right here in Minnesota alone, through our prairies and grassland restoration and avoided conversion. Wetlands and peatlands, really unique in Minnesota, are our rich peatlands. They play an important role. We hear a lot about our soil health and regenerative ag, kind of maintaining continuous land cover through cover crops, reducing emissions by using less fertilizer, and other strategies really to enhance carbon storage in the soil. And then reforestation and improved forest management. Trees store carbon, more trees store more carbon, and well-managed forests are healthy and durable and able to do their job for nature and climate. So even though natural climate solutions are often left out of the climate conversation, as you can see, they have a huge impact and help us meet our state and national goals. And what's also really important is they're solutions that can be implemented now, right now, and actually have to be implemented right now. So it's an important consideration. But today we have kind of a big announcement. The Nature Conservancy is working with many partners, so absolutely not alone, on a new goal to reforest 1 million acres of previously forested land here in Minnesota. Since we know reforestation is Minnesota's biggest opportunity, if you recall from that graph, to store carbon through nature, this solution is crucial. The new TNC science, which we make available to all of our partners and the public, has helped us identify areas where we can maximize our reforestation potential. We're in the early stages of convening partners and developing a plan because reforesting 1 million acres will be a huge lift. We're talking about a project in the order of 1.7 billion seedlings. It'll take everyone working together to make it happen. This next slide kind of shows our partners. And with that, what I want to do is turn it over to my colleague, Sachi Graber, as I mentioned, our climate policy lead, to talk a little bit about climate adaptation. Sachi?
Thanks so much, Anne. It's really great to be here. Yes, I just wanted to touch on our other major piece of work focusing on climate change. So Anne talked about mitigation, really thinking about reducing the overall amount of climate change that's happening to the world. I'm going to talk about adaptation, which is knowing that the climate is changing. We're seeing impacts. We're seeing earlier ice out, rising temperatures, more floods. What do we do about it? How do we live with that? And so, the fact of the matter is that even if we do limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we're seeing changes to our communities and we're seeing changes to nature. So I wanted to share just one great example of nature helping people adapt and people helping nature to adapt to climate change. And that's really focused on the freshwater systems that we have in abundance here in Minnesota. We know that lakes and rivers are iconic to our state, critical to our ecosystems, but they also are core to our resilience. Healthy water systems actually absorb water, which means if there's a flood, if we have healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy trees, those things can literally suck up the water. And that prevents our landscape from washing away in a flood. And it also prevents that flood from inundating our communities. Many downtowns we have, right on the lake or the river shore. At the same time, we know that healthy ecosystems, they not only absorb water, but they retain it. And that means that during droughts, we can keep water on the landscape using nature. These things are important because, we're not only protecting the land, protecting our nature, protecting our ecosystems, but we can keep our communities more resilient using nature. And some of the work the Nature Conservancy has already been doing for years, protecting the Mississippi River headwaters, is a great example of on-the-ground work that not only helps with conservation, not only keeps our ecosystems healthy, but really can help our communities when we think about climate change impacts.
So that was a long way to answer your question.
No, it's really fantastic. I think one of the things that happens so often when we're talking about climate is that the scale of this is so big that it's, my experience has often been that people's eyes glaze over. I hope none of the 90 people here have their eyes glazing over right now. But that's really been part of the issues. They can't get their head around it. What I really love is that you're breaking this down in a way that is large scale. The amount of trees you're talking about is enormous, but it's a tactical, strategic way that somebody can get their head around that. So what does that really mean to somebody who, say, wants to be part of it? Are you going to ask people to go volunteer for trees? Is the real issue that you need money to do this? Just get real tangible for people who want to act. How do they help?
I'd love to get tangible on that one because it's a lot. So first of all, we are trying to get the word out about natural climate solutions, and we want people to use their voice. In that, there's a lot we need to do in terms of energy policy and our energy systems. That's critical and vital, and we're huge supporters of that work. And we need to put nature to work, and we need to put nature to work now. So use your voice. That's number one. Second is help support organizations that can help amplify your voice. I think that's really, really important to do that. There's a lot of organizations, the Nature Conservancy is one, and we'd be honored to have you join us on this journey. But certainly join organizations that could amplify your voice. And then advocating for policy change and funding. So yes, climate change actually gets less than 2% of philanthropic funding. Natural climate solutions is a teeny fraction of that. We need private philanthropy to help support getting public resources. behind efforts. And so that's what we do. And I think we do well at the Nature Conservancy is we use private philanthropy to help us advocate for large dollars, public dollars, to help move forward with these kinds of solutions. So I would say that's the big ask. I don't know if now is a good time, RT, but I do want to mention that we do have at the Nature Conservancy a Climate Solutions Fund, which we are partnering right now with the Minneapolis Foundation. So thank you to all of you at the Minneapolis Foundation. We have two co-chairs of that fund who are wonderful community leaders, Tim Welsh and Wendy Bennett, who are both extraordinary leaders and have been really, really helpful to us in advising us and guiding our work. And I'm pleased to say we have a wonderful match for this fund. For the first 10 folks that contribute, or 12 folks that contribute over $10,000, we have a generous donor who is going to match those first 12 $10,000 gifts. So I get to announce that today too. That's another way you can help.
That's great. Okay, well, that's really wonderful. Let me ask about the issue of reforestation and how nature adapts, putting these two things together. You know, we have this really fascinating landscape here. It's where the big woods meet the prairie. We've got oak savanna, we've got boreal forest. There's all that we're hearing about how we're losing more and more of the boreal forest. Is the idea to replace everything as it was, and is that possible? Or is the idea to recognize that the reforestation will not be necessarily repeating what it was?
Right.
How realistic do we have to be about evolution on that?
Right. So there's two really big things there. One is restoration of our forests and making them healthy. Climate change and other factors have already impacted a lot of our forests. So for example, on the North Shore, you'll see that impact with dying stands of birch trees. That is a result of a whole number of years of challenges. So we're doing a lot of work in terms of restoration of our forests so that they can be strong and resilient to climate change and continue to benefit climate and benefit our water and other systems for many years to come. So that is a body of work. But you mentioned something really important. So then there's reforestation. So we know that science tells us that the potential in Minnesota is 3.4 million acres of potential restoration of forested land that was previously forested doing its job. We're making the goal of getting at 1 million of those acres. Those acres kind of fall, in a swath on the prairie forest border. Trees were taken down for development, for agriculture, and many other purposes, a lot of marginal lands. So the goal is to really target those lands, let science drive us as to where to target those lands, and get at the business of planting trees, and lots of them. And it's a big effort and a challenging effort, and it's going to take all of the partners, the state, the soil and water conservation districts, cities, counties, towns, all getting behind an effort like this.
So what you need is people to give to the fund. The fund plants trees. You're going to look in that line probably about like where 94 goes up, where, right, sort of basically where the woods meet the prairie. Maybe I've got it a little too far west, but that's the idea. So also, is there a call for people to plant their own trees or not? I mean, often like when you're building a plaza, people will buy bricks, and that's not where the big money comes from, but it's actually how you engage people. Is that part of this too?
Absolutely. Sachi, I don't know if you want to jump in at all. I wanted to include you in the conversation. So if there's anything you want to jump in on here, please do.
And Sachi, as I turn it over to you, I just want to remind the people listening, the chat's being monitored. So if you just put questions in the chat, we can pick it up. Sorry, Sachi, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, RT, and thanks, Anne. The only thing I'd want to add here is to your original question, kind of, RT, about what's happening within our forests as we see climate change. You're exactly right. There are some species that are doing worse than they used to. The birch on the North Shore are one of them. There are lots of new diseases and pests that are starting to emerge with climate change. And there are some species that are doing much better. And so we're seeing different species kind of shift their geographies according to where conditions are most suitable for them. So one program that we're actually working on is thinking about climate adapted tree seedlings. And the idea there is exactly what you mentioned. It's right. What are the types, the species of trees that will do best in an area, given that the climate is changing, temperatures are warming, precipitation is changing? What are the species that have the best probability of surviving? And how can we actually make sure that we have enough seedlings of those species to plant? Right now, I mean, Anne mentioned 1 million acres of trees, and currently we don't have enough seedlings to cover 1 million acres. And so as we think about enhancing that capacity, growing our ability to, foster new baby trees, we also want to make sure that we're growing the right types of trees to survive in the changing environment.
Yeah.
Can I ask just on that last question, just kind of a rookie question? So let's say somebody wants to, on their own house, I want to plant a tree just to be a part of this. Are there some trees that are much better at this than others?
There are, and there are actually resources out there that can help you identify which species will be best adapted to your geography, which are more resilient, meaning, if the climate changes a little bit differently than we expected, which trees are most likely to survive. And we can share that link after this talk maybe, but I know NIAX has some really great resources and kind of fact sheets on trees by your geography.
Okay. I wanted to jump in if it's okay, RT, because I'm cheating a little bit and looking at the chat. Okay. And there was a question that I really find interesting, and it's the age-old question of, does urban tree planting make a difference? And the answer is yes. And so the Nature Conservancy is always looking to get to scale, large geographies. Where does science show us that we need to go to get to really large swaths of land? And that is really, really important. And interestingly, on this reforestation, that gets us pretty close to the metro area based on the prairie forest border. Nurstrand Bigwoods, for those of you who know Nurstrand Bigwoods, that's the old, big woods of Minnesota, and extending that throughout all the way up and towards the central Minnesota really gets close to the metro. But in addition to that, urban tree planting itself is critically important because we mentioned the impacts of climate change impacting vulnerable communities, heat islands, water quality. Getting at tree planting in the urban core is very important, and we emphasize that. And the Nature Conservancy is really looking for some new partners in these urban areas to really think about how our traditional work, which is getting at these big swath and scales, can touch more closely down in the urban area. So I wanted to address that because I thought that was really important.
Great. Jessica Blair from your team, who was integral in making this work, is also monitoring the chat. Jessica, how are we doing in the chat?
Yeah, we have some questions. Thanks for the pause there. A question about the reforestation effort. How much of the 1 million acres are on public land? How much on private? And will we need to be, there's one here, is land going to be purchased to meet this goal?
Those are fabulous questions, because people that know the Nature Conservancy's history, our first deal was all about people buying private land and protecting it. That's how we started. We have long moved to a much broader strategies, which involve us working with our public sector partners and working on public lands, protecting lands that go into the public domain, and this is the big and, working with private landowners. So some of these strategies will absolutely be on private lands, not lands that we will ever purchase. Will some purchasing occur? I'm sure it will. That isn't our number one strategy in this effort, though. Land protection, the traditional kind where you buy land, is probably not the number one strategy for reforestation. It has been a huge strategy for protecting our prairie lands. So those of you on this call that know that, know our work with prairie restoration, that has been a huge strategy. Probably not as much in this work. We're going to be working with large public landowners like cities and counties. We've traditionally worked with states, but really getting to work with cities and counties. But it's also going to be working with private landowners. So for example, farmers that are looking to convert on, non-productive pasture land. Lots of opportunities like that. So this is going to be, these strategies are going to look a little different.
And walk with that a little bit, because that's a really interesting thought. I of course went automatically to public lands, or you guys buying up land, which is unbelievably expensive, right? You can actually get a lot more done if you're on private lands. But let's take a farmer right now who's getting some sort of a federal subsidy not to plant crops on their land. To actually not just leave it unseeded, but actually to plant trees there. You'll actually work with farms on that.
Yeah, and Sachi, do you want to jump in on this as well? Because Sachi is really helping us on the policy side of how we're trying to advance some of these goals.
Yeah, I would say there are lots of different opportunities there, and certainly, encouraging folks who have fallow land to plant more trees is one of them. But I would also say, RT, that you're kind of getting to an interesting point there about how are farmers a part of this process. Yes, trees are a critically important way to store carbon, but we don't have to ask all of our farmers to convert their cropland to trees. There are lots of other practices, keeping cover crop on the land, like Anne mentioned earlier, reducing the amount of tillage we have to prevent carbon from being emitted from the soil. There are plenty of ways that farmers can actually be taking the lead, continuing to produce crops and also helping to store more carbon in their soil.
I really appreciated that pivot to because planting trees on ag land is a strategy when that makes sense and that ag land is unproductive and not moving forward in its current form. But we know that land use and agriculture are really a top source of emissions in Minnesota. And you saw that bar graph that I showed in that PowerPoint. So things like cover crops, no-till ag, nutrient management, other annual crops are critical strategies. We have 50,000 acres in a pilot program in Minnesota, really testing carbon storage. And that's really, really important because we have to actually reduce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have this growing world, right? Our population is booming across the globe. So the demand for food is critical. And transitioning food is part of the solution, but we're not going to transition that food overnight. We need our current agriculture system to retain a lot more of those greenhouse gases in the ground and sequester carbon. So that is a kind of another, in addition to reforestation, that is the other major play in Minnesota, is how are we working on soil health with our agricultural community?
Yeah, that graph really popped up for me because reforestation was the number one strategy we identified, cover cropping number two, and anyone listening here should know that that's really where this series is going to move now. Now, next, as we move into the summer, that Climate Reaction is going to have a series of tours that we're going to be making available. It's going to start with visiting a couple of farms, including Sharing Our Roots Farm down in Northfield. That really is a farm that, what's that?
That's awesome. I think
it's really going to be great. And I'm really excited because our tour guide is going to be Julie Ristow, who's really one of the great pioneers in the state in urban rural connections. And she helped start that farm, and we'll be visiting a couple of others on that. So I think between this effort on reforestation and then the work on the summer. So everybody will be getting, who's on this call, will be getting a video of the interview I did with Julie that'll preview those tours. So let's go back to the chat. Jessica, do we have anything else in there?
Oh, yes, we have a lot of wonderful questions. And I'm going to just choose a couple and let you go. Can you explain how carbon markets are playing a role to encourage land management? And then another, what role does the Department of Natural Resources play in this effort?
Well, you can imagine, I'm going to start with the DNR and then Sachi tee up carbon markets for you, and you and I can go talk a bit about that. So the DNR plays a critical role, and there's some great legislation that they have put forward this year around, you heard Sachi mention seedlings, and we don't have enough to increase. The state has a whole production of seedlings, and they've got new money in the bonding bill to try to really advance our seedling production. And we need to actually turn that up on mega high in order to get this work done. And they know that the restoration work on their public lands is critically important. So we work hand in hand with the DNR, and it's usually mostly a very positive relationship. So they're a really important partner. But I'm going to flip it to Sachi because we do want to talk about carbon markets because they're both controversial and vitally important.
Yes, I'm so glad someone asked that question. And I'm assuming that means you're at least a little bit familiar with how carbon markets work. But the theory there is that, some individuals are doing fantastic work storing carbon in whatever way they're using. Maybe it's planting trees, maybe it's using cover crops, maybe it's using some form of technology. And on the flip side, we have a lot of entities, often corporations, who are really tracking their carbon emissions and trying to find ways to reduce their footprint. And so many of those corporations use offsets, which means kind of purchasing the ownership of that carbon that's stored elsewhere to help limit the amount of bottom line emissions they're responsible for. Carbon markets are in a lot of ways really great because they have very strong requirements for what kind of projects can be used. And that means if you want to enter a project into a carbon market, if you want to get paid for selling that offset, your projects have to meet a number of requirements. They have to be permanent, meaning that carbon, you can't plant a tree and cut it down in 20 years. That carbon has to stay stored on the land or wherever. They have to be additional, meaning if you already have a whole, 100 acres of trees, that doesn't really count. That was already there. We're talking about additional efforts to plant new trees or add new cover crops or whatever the case may be. One of the really interesting gaps with carbon markets right now is that there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? If you're trying to understand, is this project permanent? Is it additional? Does it meet all of these requirements? Where's all the paperwork? That can be really tough for small landowners to enter into because the costs to entry are so high. And so there are a couple of really unique programs that we're just starting to explore to think about how can smaller landowners also participate, be a part of this movement, and often, get access to the the funding that they need to make these carbon projects actually happen. So Anne mentioned the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. That's a great kind of first foray into what could this look like on farms? How could we compensate farmers for the carbon they're storing? We are also engaged in the Family Forest Carbon Program, which similarly works with small landowners who are planting trees to try to kind of combine many projects into something that's big enough to be marketable.
Great. Let's take, Jessica, if we could take one more question from you, and then Anne, I'm going to ask you to mention where that fund is, how people can get to that fund again. So Jessica, can we take one more from you?
You bet. RT, this one is multi-part. Take advantage of the opportunity. Folks are curious about both what is the Nature Conservancy doing to prevent deforestation in Minnesota, and then how will we ensure that any improvements, reforestation or agricultural practices can be continued into the future? Do we contemplate conservation easements? How can we ensure that the carbon stays in the plant material or the soil?
Boy,
we have some really smart people on this call.
Great set of questions. I am going to start with preventing deforestation because I think that's really important. We've got to start there. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that are interesting in Minnesota. So not many people know this, but in the about 5 years ago or so, and don't quote me exactly on the year, but I think that's about right. About 5 or so years ago, Minnesota had the highest rate of deforestation of any place in the country, and even broader. And that was happening, interestingly, in the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And basically, it was land. You might have read about the pines to potatoes phenomenon. It was land that was being deforested, and they were planting potatoes, to sell to McDonald's, and it was taking off like wildfire. The good news is that has slowed. because of a whole lot of conservation partners coming together in the headwaters. We had launched the Our Water campaign, which put a lot of effort into protecting those lands through conservation easements, which were mentioned, permanent conservation easements. There's some great organizations in Minnesota, including ourselves, but the Minnesota Land Trust, I would point out, that holds a lot of conservation easements. So conservation easements was one strategy. Another strategy was working with another conservation partner, a wonderful one, the Conservation Fund, who purchased 70,000+ acres of potlatch land that went on the market. There was a lot of that land that was going on the market and flipping to potatoes early on. And the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, the Minnesota Land Trust, and others came together to really address those issues as well. So addressing deforestation is critical, and we're doing that every day in Minnesota, some through land acquisition, some, and you saw that in the property in the Northeast that some folks have mentioned, some through conservation easements and many other tactics that we're using. So that's the deforestation side. The second piece was, Jessica or Sachi?
Agriculture. How do we ensure that that the carbon stays in soil?
Yeah, that's another great question, and I'm going to open this up to include Sachi as well. So that's more challenging because the length of time. So, for example, some of the programs that the federal government and the Farm Bill offer to farmers are 10 years or 15 years in scope. They're not permanent in scope. So that all needs to be taken into consideration when you're getting at issues around market and offsets. It makes that really challenging. So, which is why most have started, most of this offset work is forestry work at this point. But there is an effort to create incentives for farmers for positive soil health practices, which benefit not only, sequestering carbon, but also water quality and food production, quite frankly. So that's why this Ecosystems Services Market Consortium is made up of the private sector, a lot of corporations, a lot of conservation organizations, and farmers are all involved in this to figure out if there are ways to create incentives for farmers to do these practices longer term. But I would say that the jury is still out a bit on permanence on agricultural land. Sachi, would you want to add to that?
I think you hit it on the head, Anne. The one thing I would add is around that issue of permanence, right? So there are two ways we can think about reducing emissions through farming practices. One is pulling carbon out of the air and storing it in the soil, as we know plants can do. The other is just not emitting carbon in the first place, or greenhouse gases in the first place. So that's where things like reduced fertilizer use through nutrient management. If we put less nitrogen on the ground in the first place, it won't convert to nitrous oxide and result in global warming when it gets released into the atmosphere. So that is a permanent strategy, right? If I don't put fertilizer on the ground this year, my 2021 emissions will never occur in that sense. The other piece I just want to add about permanence, and this gets a little bit farther away from the carbon market conversation, but impermanent strategies still have value. So if I can commit to using cover crops for 10 years and getting some carbon stored, maybe I'm not going to qualify for a carbon market. It's not going to be a totally permanent strategy. But with climate change, what we know is we need to do everything we can right now to prevent the worst outcomes. And that gets to all kinds of science and equity issues, thinking about the fact that, the US is a major emitter and we haven't figured out how to reduce our emissions sufficiently to meet some of these goals yet. So even if I can commit to reducing my emissions for 10 years, maybe that gives us time as a city or as a state or as a country to find the right solutions that will be permanent. So carbon markets aside, that 10-year project isn't going to qualify for credits or offsets or anything, but there's definitely value to be had even in short-term actions that can give us a little bit of a cushion in terms of getting to those goals.
Oh boy, I really want to thank you for that work, and especially the work that Nature Conservancy did is doing in the Mississippi headwaters. I was really horrified as I was hearing about incredibly valuable forest being sold out for potatoes. You could almost have a slogan, more fries mean we all fry. But in any case, why don't we finish up with you telling people how they can tangibly get involved in helping on it. And by the way, I do want to thank Tim Welsh and Wendy Bennett, who've done so many great things in this community for really stepping up and helping to lead this effort. So how do people help?
Well, first of all, Jessica put in the chat kind of how you can get to our website and our Nature for Climate campaign. So that's in the chat right now. But our climate solutions fund is really important. $10,000 or greater will help unlock, as NPR has so well articulated, a great match from a generous donor. So we'd really appreciate contributions to that. How we will use that fund is advancing our natural climate solutions through public policy, through engaging other people, through direct work on the ground, and many, many more ways. So we invite you to join the Climate Solutions Fund. We would love to have you. I know many of you are already incredibly generous contributors to the Nature Conservancy, so thank you. But I also want to say there are a lot of wonderful organizations out there, and I know there's a lot of competition for your generosity, and we appreciate that and respect that tremendously. But remember that climate overall from philanthropy receives less than 2% of philanthropy. So we are on at a critical moment where timing is everything. We have 10 years to turn this around. 10 years to turn this around. This is an all hands on deck effort. So I just want to thank you, RT, for hosting us. This was so kind and so wonderful for the Minneapolis Foundation. And we're just honored to be able to be here and share these ideas with you and invite you all on our journey.
Well, we're really, really honored to be a partner with you on it, because it's really important work. And I just love how you've taken an issue that could be mind-bogglingly complex and not dumbed it down, but given us a very clear path on what we can do together. So thank you. One of the things that I really regret is that we're doing this virtually, because what we try to do at the Minneapolis Foundation is create a community of generosity. We want you all to meet and become partners in this work. And I wish we could all be in a room doing that. But we are going to try that now. So the first time in this climate reaction series, we're going to try to actually come together. And that's what we're going to do on these tours. So you'll be getting a follow-up from this that will give you a link so that you can pass this recording on, but also we'll tell you about what's coming up this summer. So sign up for that. You'll get a video also of Julie Bristow, who's going to be our tour guide. And then you can sign up to go on our tour, starting with sharing our roots farm and seeing some other places. That we'll drive separately. We'll be socially distanced there, but we think we can pull it off now. And it'll be really exciting to see some of you together. And I hope as part of that, you get to meet, you get to talk, hopefully share ideas and become part of a generous community that cares very much about our planet and about building an equitable society. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks again, Anne, and all of you at Nature Conservancy. Really great work.
Thank you. And don't hesitate to reach out to me, to Jessica, to Sachi at the Nature Conservancy for any questions you didn't get answered and you want to go deeper on. You can find us at tnc.org.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.